Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. So, today we are going to be continuing our look at the art of the 20th century, and in particular, we're going to be looking at the period of time between the First and Second World Wars. So, jumping right on in. As we should know, 1914, World War One starts with great patriotic zeal. Many people thought that, this was going to be a very quick war. It was going to be over by, Christmas of that same year. There hadn't been a major war in Europe since the time of Napoleon. The last major kind of conflict that anyone could remember had only lasted about a year or two. So no one was really all that worried about it. In fact, most people were very optimistic. However, it turns out to be much more devastating than people had initially thought it would be. So here we can see a photograph taken on the Western Front in northern France. Once again, it's just an extremely devastating conflict. Here we can see an image that shows just a little bit of the toll that the First World War took. What we see here is a before and after picture of the Belgian village of Passchendaele after the Third Battle of Ypres. And what we see in the right here, all of these little white dots that we see, each one of those is a shell crater from artillery. So this is very common, very indicative of the First World War. This is what comes to be known as drum fire barrages. So these are artillery barrages that are so intense that they would sound like a drum roll. In fact, many veterans who survived these experiences actually talked about only being able to hear white noise because of how intense they were. If you didn't go deaf, completely at all. But once again, this is something that's very devastating. As we can see, these attacks would last for 24 hours a day, sometimes for weeks, even months on end. So very, very physically devastating. In fact, even today, over 100 years later, there are entire areas of Belgium and northern France that are completely uninhabitable because of this. In fact, they're still digging up huge amounts of unexploded bombs in the ground, mass graves, all kinds of stuff. Very, very devastating. So, all totaled, roughly 10 million people died during the First World War, and over 20 million people were casualties or were wounded in some way. Here we can see what's known as the Dumont Ossuary. This is a building that houses nothing but the bones of fallen soldiers from the Battle of Verdun alone. So, this entire massive building is filled from floor to ceiling with nothing but human remains from one battle in this war. And very, very devastating. But aside from this, large scale devastation, we also see that the political and cultural landscape of the world was forever changed by this conflict. So here we can see Europe before and after the First World War, in which we see that the German and Austro Hungarian empires, as well as the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, are all completely dissolved. We have the new nations of Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, etc., that are born out of this. The USSR is born out of the First World War. China and Japan also start to become the political entities that we know of them as being today out of this conflict as well. So it's a very important event in our history, and we're still dealing with many of the consequences of it today. In fact, a large amount of the problems in the Middle East today stem from the disillusionment of the Ottoman Empire by the British and the French after this conflict. So once again, even 100 years later, we're still dealing with consequences from this conflict. But aside from this, we also see that civil war in Germany following the First World War, along with the total economic collapse of the German economy, as well as grievances with the terms of armistice that ended the First World War, give rise to Nazism. So Adolf Hitler comes to power during this interwar period. But it's not just Hitler. We also see the rise of fascism in Italy and Spain in particular. In Italy, fascism comes about underneath Benito Mussolini, and in Spain under General Francisco Franco. And so we see this is a kind of divisive period in time. A lot of divisive political movements are coming about and everything like this. But out of these, kind of devastating or horrific set of circumstances, we see a lot of other things beginning to change as well. So it's not just, society and everything like that, but we also see a lot of artists are looking at this kind of chaos and wondering why we should still be adherent to these quote unquote traditional value systems which have brought all of this chaos about. So, aside from the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, etc., we also see that the economies of Britain and France were both utterly devastated by the First World War as well. And it's during this time that we also see the governments beginning to assume new powers over not only the mobilization of people, but materials, over economic life, censorship, public information, and all kinds of different things like this. So, for instance, it's during this period that America really starts to become a major power within the world stage. But it's also during this time that many governments begin to, enlist drafts into the army as compulsory, requirements for citizenship and things like that. We also see that, in general, the First World War is the first true total war in human history in which a country's entire resources are solely devoted to the conflict itself. So, governments begin to sequester all kinds of raw materials that might not have otherwise been sequestered before, things like that. But we also see, lots of censorship starting to happen in this period as well. Here in America, this is when things like the Sedition Act come into being, and these are laws passed in this country which unfortunately are still on the books today, which basically make it illegal to be critical of your government in times of war and all kinds of things like that, which ironically is fundamentally against the many of the ideas of this country and everything like that. So in this sense, we see in a lot of places dissent becomes quote unquote unpatriotic, but that's a very subjective thing to say. But once again, we see this general kind of trend in the world. But many artists of this period, consciously link their creations to a hope for a better world. So once again, they're kind of looking at the chaos that's been brought about by traditional, kind of moral values, and they're saying, well, why should we do these things? All it's brought us is death and destruction. So why can't we do something better, something more utopian, if you will? So there becomes this tendency for art to become a tool of social betterment during this period, or at least this is a kind of general hope for it, or kind of push for it, if you will. So that brings us to one of the first major artistic movements of this interwar period. And once again, stylistic pluralism is still going to be very prominent. During this time, we still also have artists dealing with Cubism and Futurism and, all kinds of different things. But Dada, or the Dada movement itself, began as a protest against the horror of World War One. So it begins in Zurich, Switzerland. Many artists actually escaped their home countries and would go to Switzerland, which was neutral, in order to evade military service and everything like that. But still, there are many prominent artists who, serve in the First World War and then go on to create artwork about that experience, even in this realm of Dadaism and everything like that. So there is a lot of tie over there. But the name itself was meant to be ambiguous and represented more of a kind of rebellious attitude rather than a cohesive style. So once again, even though Dadaism is considered a style now, many artists are kind of doing their own thing with it. But once again, it's important to note that Dada itself is a nonsense word, and it's meant to kind of capture this kind of sense of absurdity within, this kind of world that's kind of devolving around itself, if you will. But Dadaists thought the destructive absurdity of war was caused by these quote unquote traditional values, which they sought to overturn. So, a lot of what Dadaist art is trying to do is point out our own inherent absurdities, as well as the inherent absurdities within society at large, and trying to redirect some of that kind of energy, animosity, all of these kinds of things. So I wanted to read I like these two quotes that I have for you about Dadaism, about its spirit and the time in which it's born. So if you permit me, I'd like to read these to you. So our first one comes from Marcel Janco, a very prominent Dadaist artist originating out of Italy. But he's quoted as saying, Dada was not a school of artists, but an alarm signal against declining values. Routine, art speculation, a depressed appeal on, or a desperate appeal on behalf of all forms of art for a creative basis on which to build a new and universal consciousness. And similarly, the French artist Jean Arp is also quoted as saying, while the thunder of guns rolled in the distance, we sang, painted, glued, and composed for all of our worth. We were seeking an art that would heal mankind from the madness of the age. So, in essence, Dadaists are really trying to point the mirror back at society itself and point this mirror back at the absurdity which they're viewing all around them at this time. And, once again, this is coming out of a conflict in which we are becoming even more deadly than we have ever been. This is the first conflict in which the machine gun is used, the first conflict in which poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, airplanes, all kinds of horrific new weapons are used, and it just makes the carnage and the just absurdity of the whole thing that much more extreme. And so these Dadaist artists are trying to kind of point the spotlight back in that direction, so that hopefully people might be able to see some of these absurdities. So the insanity of war proved to Dadaists that European culture had lost its way. They begin to reject most moral, social, political, as well as aesthetic values. So we really see that a lot of what's happening in artwork from the Renaissance to up to this point is basically just going to be thrown out the window and need no longer apply, at least in this period. But it seemed pointless for many of these artists to find meaning in a world where so-called rational behavior had produced only chaos and destruction. And so we're just really going to embrace the absurdity that we could possibly come up with for this art style. But Dada aimed to shock viewers into seeing this absurdity of the Western world's social and political situation at that time. So once again, it's something that many artists are going to be dealing with in a variety of different ways. They're all going to be coming to it in their own kind of personal style and everything like that. But one of the most prominent Dadaist artists, in fact, he's the artist most heavily associated with Dada, is Marcel Duchamp. And we saw Marcel Duchamp a little bit last time in our discussion of futurism and cubism and whatnot. He definitely bridges the gap across many of these early 20th century artistic styles and everything like that. But what Marcel Duchamp is really well known for is challenging our notion of what art really is. And so this is perhaps his most well-known piece. This is Fountain by R. Mutt. And what Marcel Duchamp did is he walked into a hardware store and he purchased a urinal and he presented it upright in an orientation which makes it unuseful, and he assigned a fake name onto it. And when he first presented this, people hated it. I mean, people really vehemently hated it. And part of why they hated it is because they didn't consider it to be an actual art object. in that Marcel Duchamp did not actually create this object. He went out and bought it ready-made. And so this idea of the ready-made, or our acceptance or viewing of an object for its inherent aesthetic qualities, is something that's very key and very central to Dadaist art, especially Dadaist sculpture in general. So basically, he's almost mocking the art critic and the art world of that time by presenting us with a utilitarian object that's been made unuseful, if you will. But it's also being completely irreverent towards art history, in that usually sculpture is, reserved for this really kind of lofty realm of gods and deities and, all of that kind of stuff. And then here we have just a urinal, something that's meant to be, pissed in, if you will. And once again, it's elevating something low to a high place. It's, taking an average person and presenting them on heroic scale, and things like that. It's being irreverent in the face of art history and of the art world of his day, which is still very much tied to academic art coming out of the 19th century and everything like that. So he's really trying to challenge us to see things in different ways and to see the aesthetic qualities within objects that might not otherwise be considered artistic, if you will. But he does a number of these ready-mades. They vary quite extensively over the course of his career. This is perhaps his other most famous one. But what he does in this, he actually walks into the Louvre Museum's gift shop. He purchases a postcard of the Mona Lisa. He draws a kind of pencil goatee and mustache on her. And then he writes the title LHOOQ, which, if we were to pronounce this in French very quickly, it's kind of a vulgar pun, which roughly translates to "she's hot in the tail," or, basically she's got a nice ass, if you will. But once again, this is meant to be a kind of irreverent gesture to this very established, art historical canon of Leonardo da Vinci as kind of an end-all be-all of Renaissance artwork. So here we're taking one of his arguably most famous work of art, and we're defacing it, and we're being irreverent towards its position within the art historical canon, and everything like that. But we're also being humorous and playful with it as well. It's not necessarily meant to be insultingly vulgar. It's more meant to be humorously vulgar, if you will. So once again, the main idea of this, though, is kind of decimating this, tradition of art history and of, the lineage of artists that are deemed important within that, kind of historical context and everything like this. So it's really meant, once again, to highlight this kind of absurd quality within the artwork itself, but also it's meant to challenge our notions of what art is, but also how art can, be changed or demystified or mystified, if you will, within the confines of this, kind of historical, lexicon that promotes certain things over others, etc., etc., etc. So it's once again, it's meant to be irreverent, but it's also meant to be playful and humorous and everything like that as well. Now, aside from Marcel Duchamp, we also have, other prominent artists that are dealing with Dadaism that also go on to explore other realms and possibilities as well. One such artist is this individual. This is Man Ray. He has his beginnings within Dadaism, but he goes on to be a very prominent surrealist as well. He does a lot of work with Salvador Dali later on in his career and everything like that. But during his Dadaist phase, he's also creating these ready-made objects, or these ready-made sculptures, if you will. And so here we can see his assemblage sculpture known as Gift from 1921. And what Man Ray did is he walked into a hardware store, he bought a flat iron, a box of tacks, and a thing of glue. And he glued these tacks onto this flat iron. And so basically he's taken a utilitarian object, presented it in a non-utilitarian way, and he's also made it completely unfunctioning, or at least unfunctional for its intended use. And in some sense, he's even made it more dangerous than it possibly could have been. So once again, he's presenting this object for its own pure aesthetic value, aside from its utilitarian function. So obviously, the iron being presented upright like this, we can't use it for its intended use anymore in that orientation, but the tacks also make it completely unusable in that sense as well. But once again, this is meant to echo this idea that we can create artwork out of objects that we do not physically create ourselves, because we are challenging our recognition of aesthetic quality or beauty within these objects and everything like this. So it's not necessarily that this is or is not art. It's challenging us to reinterpret what our definition of art is. And it's really basically from this point onward where art can really be anything that we can think of, so long as we can justify it. And so the Dadaists really push the boundaries in this regard really, really far. But it's not just ready-made sculptures and, assemblage sculptures such as these that we can deal with. Many other, Dadaist artists such as Hannah Hawk here also begin to embrace other non-traditional mediums as well. And so Hannah Hawk is very important for basically inventing photographic collage, or photo montage as she referred to it. So what we see here, this is one of her earlier works from 1923, and this is Multimillionaire. But this embodies not only this idea of Dadaist absurdity, but also this kind of reflection of, the mirror at society at large, if you will. So if we look throughout this, we can see a variety of things, and all of this is taken from, catalogs and newspapers and things like that. So we have the two kind of wealthy mogul figures here, but we see them surrounded by not only factory, buildings and whatnot, but also products that these factories might be creating: automobiles, tires, machine parts, guns and weaponry, all of these kinds of things. But once again, this is meant to be a reference to this, industrialized world that's starting to become more, present within the lives of many people. Excuse me. And also referencing the fact that many of these same kind of tycoons of industry are, guilty of perpetuating the brutality of warfare, and then the First World War, etc. And obviously, nowadays, we should be familiar with this whole idea with the military-industrial complex, basically pushing us to be at constant state of war, so that they can maintain their profit margins and things like that. So once again, she's kind of pointing the finger back at these rather regrettable aspects of society. And it's not that all of these things are regrettable, because, these kinds of tycoons and industries have provided us with all kinds of different, luxury items and et cetera, that have made our lives a lot better. But at the same time, they do a lot to really destroy the lives or the happiness of many people, and, all kinds of horrible things like that. So once again, it's a very non-traditional, medium in this sense. Photo collage, photography is still at this time kind of trying to be recognized as an art form in and of itself. But here we're taking photography from non-photographic sources, or we're not cutting up actual photographs. We're taking it from print material and everything like that, and rearranging these disparate elements to create new meaning and everything like this. So once again, it becomes a new medium, if you will, in and of itself. And this is something that we still deal with today. In fact, many artists still use photographic collage. I myself have used it in some of my own paintings in the past, and so it's something that's very ubiquitous for us now. But she is the kind of artist really known for creating this, or at least bringing it to wider audiences. Now, out of Dadaism is also born other movements. So it kind of combines itself with, other movements that came before it, and it influences other movements that come after it as well. And one of the next major movements that's very influential by Dada, many early surrealists were actually Dadaists to begin with, is the genre or the style of surrealism. So, in the mid 1920s, a group of artists and writers gathered to protest the direction of European culture. So, they thought that modern emphasis on science, rationality, and progress was throwing the consciousness of Europe off balance. So, they're looking at like all of these Enlightenment ideas coming out of the late 18th century, and they're thinking, well, this has really lost something within our peripheral view, if you will. So they proclaim the importance of things like dreams, fantasies, as well as hallucinations. And so surrealism was very heavily indebted to many of the kind of irrational ideas of Dadaism, but it kind of takes it to a different extreme, if you will. But it draws very heavily on ideas coming out of psychology, especially as it relates to dream interpretation, from Sigmund Freud and other things like this. Many prominent surrealists are very focused on the dreamlike state. Salvador Dali, for instance, was known to keep a dream journal by his bed so that when he woke up, he could write his dreams down very quickly before he forgot them, and then he would make artworks based on those and everything like that. But Surrealism itself launched in 1924 with the publication of their first manifesto, in which, was written by Andre Breton, but it defined the movement's purpose as the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, should be fused into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. So once again, surrealism's main goal is once again pointing out, kind of hypocrisies or aspects of civilization or society that they seem to be or that they see as being challenging or something along those lines. But it's also meant to kind of create a kind of harmony between what's actually happening in reality versus what's happening in our dream or hallucination kind of mind frame. So it's a kind of resolution of these two things. Now, here we can see one of the first major, surrealist artists who also has his beginnings in the Dadaist movement. So this is Max Ernst. So here we can see one of his Dadaist photo collages. Max Ernst is interesting in that he actually served during the First World War for the German army and later, kind of renounces that but becomes an artist and everything like this. But a lot of his work deals a lot with his experiences during the First World War, but also deal a lot with German, kind of culture at this time in between the wars, which is almost a kind of party-like atmosphere of revelry and everything like this. But here we can see probably Max Ernst's most well-known painting or his most famous surrealist painting, and this is what's known as the Elephant Celebes. And so this is a painting, and in my opinion, one of the first paintings which begins to, embrace this idea of Dadaist photo collage, in that we have all of these, kind of disparate elements that are brought together into one cohesive image that doesn't exist on its own. But it's also hearkening to certain, kind of ideas within German culture at the time. This kind of futurist idea as well, this mechanized future, if you will. But it also has some sexual undertones and connotations to it as well. So if we look through it, we can perhaps see, these disparate elements which all kind of hearken to this idea of photographic collage. But we can see this kind of elephant-like, robotic-like form, and this is meant to echo not only this idea of the elephant from the title's sake, but also this kind of mechanization or mass industrialization of the world at this time. But we can also see that the elephant, aside from its tusks down here and whatnot, we also see this kind of ambiguous fairly phallic like element here, which is not only meant to represent the kind of duct work of this machine, but also the elephant's trunk. But it's also meant to hearken to this idea of emerging sexuality as well. So, and the elephant Celebes is actually it comes from a German kind of nursery rhyme, if you will. That's nursery rhyme isn't a good term. It's more of a poem about coming of age. So it has a lot of connotations to masturbation and things like that. But once again, it's something that is at this time something that many people are not really comfortable with talking about, or at least not being open about. But so he's kind of pointing that absurdity in our face by through much more subtle kinds of means, obviously, but it still has once again these connotations to burgeoning sexuality, kind of mechanical innovation, photographic collage, all kinds of different things like this. Now, aside from Max Ernst, probably the most well-known surrealist is this individual, Salvador Dali from Spain. And a very, very interesting individual, has a very long career, most well-known for his kind of absurd mustache here. But he really embodies surrealism probably better than any other artist. Because most of these other artists are just dealing with it in their artwork itself, but Salvador Dali lived a surrealist lifestyle, if you will. So a very, very kind of absurd figure. But this is perhaps his most well-known painting, and this is also one of his earliest paintings within the kind of purely surrealistic movement. But what we see here is his Persistence of Memory from 1931. And this is meant to be, or at least hearken to, a couple different ideas. But the main idea is that time is immaterial within this. So once again, there's this kind of interesting relationship between how we in the Western world view time as being very linear, and the Eastern world, which tends to look at time as being much more cyclical. But ultimately time is a fiction. It doesn't exist. In the grand scale of the universe, time is immaterial, because it's an abstract construction that we as human beings have come up with to help measure out and track our own existence and things like that. But ultimately it's fleeting. It literally is immaterial. It means nothing. And hence we see the motif of melting clocks throughout this. And this is something that will permeate many of Dali's other paintings later on as well. We also see that, this one kind of stopwatch over here is covered in insects. This is meant to hearken to this idea of decay and entropy and everything like that. We also see that the entirety of the scene is situated in this kind of otherworldly space that exists outside of time and place, this kind of dreamlike atmosphere, if you will. In fact, many of these locations are modeled heavily after the area in Spain where Dali actually lived along the coastline. So you'll often see these kind of mountains in the background that are reminiscent of where he was actually living in Spain for most of his life. But what's interesting is that we can also see this kind of disembodied head down here. And this is actually meant to be a self-portrait of the artist. So it's obviously very weird. It's, not really recognizably realistic or anything like that. Or at least, naturalistically realistic. But it's still hearkening to this kind of, idea that we are impermanent creatures within, life and within the universe and all of these kinds of things. But Dali also does a wide variety of work. He does a lot of work that deals a lot with the politics of this time. Here we can see a work of art that is titled Autumnal Cannibalism. And this is actually meant to be Dali's kind of treatise on the Spanish Civil War, which is taking place in the 1930s. This painting is done in the middle of that conflict in 1936. But what we see here are basically two major motifs, in that we have these two lovers who we can see are embracing one another. So we can see that they're, kind of holding one another. Their heads are kind of slumped over in this kind of gestural kiss-like manner. but at the same time, they're also devouring one another. So we can see the male figure on the right here is scooping out of her breast there, and likewise she's kind of cutting out of him and everything like this. So this is meant to hearken to this idea that the Spanish people who were fighting against one another at this time are ultimately, lovers, even though at the moment they're in conflict. Because at some point they're going to have to come back together and resolve this conflict that they've been going through, much like, of any civil war that takes place. But we can also see that he has some other kind of more subtle symbolic motifs as well. So perhaps we can see the kind of condom that's hanging down here. This could also be meant to reference a woman's nylon stockings. So this idea of, stripping before the act of copulation and everything like that. But we can also see an apple balanced on the top of the male's head here. And this is meant to be a symbolic motif linking back to the story of William Tell, in which William Tell is, forced to shoot an apple off of his own son's head without killing him in order to resolve a conflict. And so, once again, it's meant to be this kind of, two people at odds are also coming together, or will ultimately have to come together in some form of resolution, if you will. So I've always thought this was one of his more interesting paintings. It's dealing with, an actual point of time within Spain itself. It's important to note that during this time, he was actually living in New York, so he fled the conflict and remained in New York throughout World War II before going back to Spain afterwards. But aside from Salvador Dali, we also have surrealists like Rene Magritte who approach it in a much more subtle kind of manner. So most of Salvador Dali's work is very akin to this. It's very wild. It's full of all kinds of little symbolic homages and all kinds of other things like that. We could have an entire semester-long class, piecing apart, just one or two of his paintings. So they can be very, very extreme in that regard. Whereas Rene Magritte tends to represent surrealism in a much more simple kind of manner that plays up this kind of impossibility within the scene, or this kind of juxtaposition between opposing forces within a given scene. So here we can see one of Rene Magritte's more famous early works of surrealist art. This is The Lovers. So we can see a male and a female embrace in this passionate kiss. However, they're not actually kissing because they each have these bags over their heads, which is creating, a barrier to the actual act. So even though they are embraced in this kind of physical act, it's also impossible at the same time. So a lot of Rene Magritte's work plays up this idea of surreality in a much more subtle juxtaposition kind of way, whereas Dali is really looking at it from more of a dreamlike or hallucinogenic kind of background. But I really like Rene Magritte's work. He does a lot of these kinds of very simple, very quiet-like paintings, but they really are kind of, mind jerkers a little bit. So I love this one, La Clairvoyance, or the Clairvoyant. So, we have him painting the portrait of a bird from an egg on the desk there. And, so it's playing up a kind of humor as well, but also this kind of strongly, juxtaposition or juxtaposing elements within the works of art themselves. Now, aside from straightforward surrealism, which we've seen in the last few slides, there also comes to be known, or what comes to be known as abstract surrealism. And this provides suggestive elements that give wide play to the viewer's imagination, emphasis, or their imagination, their recognition of emphasis, color, design, etc., rather than the storytelling content. So, abstract surrealism is going to be looking more at, what can we use to play up, the viewer's imagination of what's going on versus, say, all of this, really on the nose, kind of representational imagery that really dictates how to think about an image and things like that. So, Probably the most prominent of the abstract surrealists is this individual, Jean Miro. But we've seen some of his work earlier on, but he's really well known for doing these very amorphic kinds of forms, biomorphic shapes within his work and everything like that. So here we can see one of his earlier surrealist pieces. This is the Harlequin's Carnival from 1924, 1925. And in fact, this is even more recognizably realistic than most of his later work, which becomes much more about individual biomorphic shape versus, say, these biomorphic shapes which start to, kind of at least give the idea of certain elements. So we can see, some kind of animal-like forms throughout, some humanoid forms throughout, etc., etc. As time goes on, this begins to devolve into more purely, abstract kind of shapes and everything like that. But once again, his surrealism is a much different kind of, enigma, than many of the others who are dealing with this. Now, aside from that, aside from surrealism, we also see that many different artists are also expanding upon the various ideas of cubism during this time as well. Once again, depending on where we're at in the world, artists are going to be using cubism for different means. But we will see that it really takes off in Russia during this period. So we'll see that they make some different kind of elaborations on it there than elsewhere. So Cubism makes possible many ambiguities between presence and absence, representational and abstraction, as well as figure and ground relationships. So we can really play up many of these kind of juxtapositions within surrealism, or I'm sorry, within Cubism. But it also begins to suggest constant change and evolution. So we see that over time, and even Picasso deals with this, in that his cubism doesn't remain stagnant. It's constantly evolving over the course of his lifetime. And in fact, many other artists are, dealing with cubism in their own way and evolving it in their own ways. But by devaluing subject matter or by monumentalizing simple or personal kinds of themes that allow this kind of mass and void to elude the cubists, give effect to the flux and paradox of modern life and the relativity of its values. So by kind of dealing with simple things and simple shapes and monumentalizing them, so presenting abstract themes on the monumental or heroic scale, we're trying to kind of deal with the kind of fast-pacedness of modern life, the fast-pacedness of technological advancement, of all of these kinds of things, or at least this is the general idea. But Russian artists begin to take Cubism towards its, kind of complete abstract form and to its kind of most logical extreme, if you will. And one such individual would be Kazimir Malevich. And he's really influential in developing what comes to be known as suprematism. And so here we can see suprematist composition, airplane flying. But if we're looking at this, we could perhaps, say, well, where's the airplane in this? Well, it's not really meant to represent an airplane per se. Rather, it's meant to represent the kind of, non-representationally abstracted feeling of an airplane. So in that sense, we could view all of this as being aspects of it, or maybe just one, particular element within this. But once again, it starts to become much more simplified down to the very kind of core roots of the artistic elements and things like that. But it also starts to become monumental in that it's not necessarily meant to be a small kind of intimate moment like, say, the still lifes in analytical or synthetic cubism. Instead, it's meant to be viewed on a much more grandiose kind of scale, and therefore this kind of overwhelming presence, if you will. But this is the kind of major attribute of suprematism, is this idea of, simple color, simple shape, but using it to monumentalize these kind of fleeting aspects within our perception, if you will. But similarly, we also see that several art movements had this goal of improving the world somehow. So it's not just, artists dealing with the absurdities of the world and trying to point them out and get us to think about things in different ways. Some of it is actually trying to give a utopian vision of some kind. So, in this sense, surrealism hoped to liberate human consciousness and allow it to be free for all of its possibilities. But abstractionists felt that non representationalism would provide an ideal basis for the utopian society which they sought. However, we also see that constructivism, which is another Russian offshoot of Cubism, begins to focus on developing a new visual language for this very, kind of new industrial age. So it's trying to make artwork that's reminiscent of that industrial like quality. But we also see that the De Stijl movement in Holland begins to advocate the use of basic utopian forms and is trying to advocate a much more utopian kind of lifestyle through artwork, if you will. So we've already talked a little bit about surrealism and abstractionist, but we can talk about constructivism a little bit once again as an offshoot of Cubism in this period as well. So it's widely considered to be a kind of revolutionary movement began in Russia, inspired in part by suprematism, so inspired largely by artists like Kazimir Malevich, but it sought to create art that was relevant to modern life in form, material, and context. So there begins to be this rejection of traditional views of space as being regular and static. And so we're kind of reinterpreting our perception of space and spatial depth and everything like that. But there tends to be a preference for plein air or linear forms that suggest dynamic quality and movement within the forms. And so one of the leading constructivist artists is Leopold Pavlova, who we see here. And she's really well known for works such as this. And so here we can see her work, Painterly Architectonic. And we jump back in time just a little bit to 1918, but once again, it's meant to echo this idea of this new industrial kind of manufactured quality within the world as we know it. So, in the 19th century, we have, everything's being produced on a kind of smaller scale, even though we have industrialization starting to ramp up, but everything has a kind of craftsman-like quality to it. Whereas during this period going forward, we start to get these very, kind of rigidly formal, or I should say formalized, elements within manufacturing. So everything that's made is the exact same, and it's tens of thousands of them that are the exact same and everything like that. So we're trying to promote this kind of, modernist feel or aesthetic in that regard. So we see a lot of these forms take on these rectilinear forms. They're very undulating, and they're meant to kind of give this sense of dynamic movement and, really jerking, kind of energetic movement, if you will, as opposed to the kind of soft, kind of curving, feel of earlier times and things like that. It's meant to be rigid and in your face and energetic and all of these kinds of ideas. But once again, it's very simple on the forefront. It's really becomes much more about the interplay of color, of line, of shape, and how these elements are interacting to, challenge our perception of spatial depth and all of these kinds of things. So what we really see in works like this is a de-evolution of traditional, kind of recognition of artistic elements, principles of design, and things like that. And so gradually from this point onward, we're going to start kind of eliminating many of these elements as we go forward. And we'll see more of that next time as well. But aside from constructivism, we also have the movement known as De Stijl. And De Stijl is, once again, born out of Holland. And during this, Dutch artists took Cubism towards this kind of idea of utopian speculation, if you will. So it's really led by the painter known as Piet Mondrian. I'm sure you've seen many of his works before, or at least reference. We'll see one here in a second. But he begins to employ non-representational geometric elements that encompass 2D and 3D forms. And the goal of De Stijl in his mind was to develop a world of universal harmony. And so Piet Mondrian's very interesting. He, kind of begins his career as a post-impressionist, works through cubism, and eventually develops this De Stijl movement. But Mondrian really worked to free painting completely from both the depiction of objects as well as the expression of personal feelings. So he really based his work on the expressive potential of simple visual elements and their relationship. So, very, very simple things, and we'll see that in a second. So between 1917 and 1944, his work reflected his views of universal order by depicting straight lines, primary colors, and rectilinear shapes, and thus he reduced painting to four elements: line, shape, color, and space. And so those are the only things he's dealing with. He does not deal with any kind of recognizable imagery, no kind of subtle symbolic meaning, nothing like that. But here we can see Piet Mondrian toward the end of his life. But this is what he's really well known for, are these, kind of very straightforward compositions. And once again, he's using line, he's using shape, he's using color, and he's using space. However, I would almost argue that he's almost eliminated space out of this. The only essence of space that we can take from this is the fact that we recognize that the colored objects and the black lines and squares and whatnot are situated within the space of this two-dimensional field, if you will. But once again, his whole idea is to distill, pun intended, all of art down into these very simple, very rigidly formalized elements that are meant to echo or at least create a recognition of harmony within the viewer's eye, if you will. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. However, that brings us to political expression. So many artists are either kind of dealing with, artwork that's kind of being critical of society or trying to remove, kind of the traditions of art away from itself, for utopian kinds of ideas. But we also have artists that are dealing with politics very wholeheartedly. So even though Salvador Dali isn't really known for his political work, he is still doing political work during this time. But there are artists that deal with it more wholeheartedly than that. So many artists in the interwar period focus their art on political life. So here we can see this is a famous photograph taken during the Spanish Civil War. This is called The Falling Soldier at the Battle of Cerro Moreno on the 5th of September 1936. But this comes to be characteristic of not only that time period, but that moment in European history and everything like that. But once again, many artists are dealing with this kind of political and military upheaval in Spain because they can feel it building to what will become World War II in just a few years from this. So, in 1937, Picasso was commissioned by the doomed Spanish Democratic government during the Spanish Civil War to paint a mural for the Paris International Exhibition. And on the 26th of April of that year, he was shocked into action by the experimental mass bombing of a defenseless Basque city known as Guernica by the German Luftwaffe. So if we're unfamiliar, during the Spanish Civil War, the fascists under Francisco Franco elicited military help from Germany, specifically Adolf Hitler, who had come to power in 1933. And Hitler had been building up his kind of arsenal after the armistice of World War I, and he was basically using the incident at Guernica as a trial run for what would later become saturation or carpet bombing in World War II. And so he unleashed the Luftwaffe on Spain. They went in and basically bombed the city into oblivion. When people tried to flee, fighter planes would come in and strafe them with machine gun fire. And it was just this overall massacre. But it really opened the eyes of the world to not only what Hitler was capable of, but also to the plight of the Spanish people at this time, etc., etc., etc. But what Picasso ends up creating is this, and this is one of his more seminal masterpieces. This is the painting known as Guernica. And what's interesting about Guernica is it's presented in a very symbolic kind of way. And there are a number of symbols that we can reference in this. First and foremost, we might notice that the painting is actually done in black and white. And the reason for this is that Pablo Picasso learned of the incident through the newspaper. And so it's meant to echo this idea of the newspaper, not only in text, which we can kind of see referenced in here and there throughout, but also the idea of the black and white image in the newspaper, which is how he would have seen most of this. So we have that kind of reference. But above that, even more, we have a very powerful symbol up here, and that we have this light bulb, which is illuminating the kind of scene here of all of these people trying to flee the German bombardment. But this eye, or this light here, is meant to reference not only the all-seeing eye of God, so as to say that the divine, the Almighty, is aware of this plight and is aware of the injustice in this and everything like that. But more importantly, this is meant to represent the all-seeing eye of the media, and that in this day and age, you can't hide anything. It will get found out. People will speak up about it. They'll speak out against you, etc., etc. But once again, this is meant to be very important because only, a few decades prior to this, word might not travel all that fast, but it's starting to become much more ubiquitous in that people all over the world hear about this incident and they're shocked, they're aghast by it and everything like this. So once again, it's meant to be an echoing of the fact that the perpetrators of this massacre would not be able to hide, that retribution would be coming for them, etc., etc. But if we look further, we can also see some other, major elements. We see a woman, kind of screaming in lament as she holds her slain child. We see a horse here, which is meant to be a representation of soldiers and whatnot, and this kind of like the cavalry fleeing and everything like that. We also see a slain soldier on the ground down here who's holding a broken sword, and this is meant to be symbolic of the futility of war and everything like this. But we also see people in general fleeing and everything like that. But once again, this is a massive painting. This painting is at like 20 by 30 feet and everything like this. It's just huge, but it's really done as a form of protest against this action that the Germans commit against the Spanish. But interviewed during the war, Picasso remarked that, quote, painting is not done for decoration. It is an instrument of war for attack and defense against an enemy. And I really like this quote because it really highlights the potential for artwork to be used for propagandic kinds of reasons. So not only does, a work like Guernica shock us and make us, contemplate, a given situation, it also can shock us and spurn us into action. In fact, there are many people who volunteer to fight in the Spanish Civil War who are not even Spanish. In fact, Ernest Hemingway, famous writer, was a cab driver, an ambulance driver, in the Spanish Civil War. And, many, many different people would go, not only from America, but Britain. A number of, prominent Germans who would later come to more fame during World War II, fought on the side of the fascists in Spain, etc., etc., etc. So it's highlighting the fact that artwork can be used to persuade people into a variety of different things as well. Now, unfortunately, saturation bombing or carpet bombing becomes a major tactic on all sides of World War II, with America and Britain being the most, kind of heavy users of it. In fact, basically the United States 8th Air Force leveled almost all of Italy and Germany. We destroyed countless numbers of art treasures. If we remember Gustave Courbet's The Stonebreakers from last time, that was actually destroyed in a fire during World War II, by American bombs. And so it's really horrific. It's really devastating. It's really regrettable that all of this ever took place, but it's still something that we have to deal with. Oh, sorry about that. Now, along the lines of political artwork, we also have a style that comes to be known as social realism. And so this is a socially and politically committed art form which becomes, very common during this interwar period and as well afterwards, for a few decades there. Now, the style takes many different forms, but all retreat from the radical innovations of modern art with a desire to communicate more readily with the public about social causes and issues. So, as opposed to, being really vehemently avant-garde and abstraction and eliminating, visual elements and things like that, social realism is really going to go back to this kind of like 19th century academic realism, if you will. However, in Nazi Germany and communist Russia, this style becomes an officially sponsored norm which had to be embraced to govern a successful career. So, Nazi Germany really hated abstract work, modernist work. Hitler himself had aspirations of being an artist, and he went through and purged a lot of this abstract and avant garde work from Germany as well as its conquered territories, and burned a lot of it, sold a lot of it, et cetera, et cetera. But, so in Nazi Germany, you had to adhere to this social realism style in order to actually be successful. Our friend Otto Dix, who we saw earlier on in the semester, was blacklisted during this period and was not allowed to show any of his work publicly. But the example I have after this are both coming out of communist Russia. I don't show any of the Nazi stuff because it's pretty straightforward. You should know what it's about. It's really promoting racial kind of superiority and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't show it for that reason. But a lot of this social realism really comes to be synonymous with like the communist countries. If you've ever seen like, propaganda posters from China and North Korea, and all of that, it's all social realism. It's just a different form of it. But here we can see an example coming from the Paris international exhibition from 1937. So this was also displayed at the same time as Pablo Picasso's Guernica. But what we see here is Vera Mukina's Monument to the Proletariat and Agriculture. And so we see two allegorical figures which are meant to represent the Russian working class. So we have the male figure here who is meant to represent the proletariat or this kind of factory worker. We can see that he's holding up a hammer, so for forging, steel and iron and things like that. Whereas this female figure who is meant to allegorically represent agriculture or the traditional kind of economic system of Russia, we see that she's holding the sickle, which is used for harvesting grain and everything like that. But we see them coming together as equals in triumph and all of this. Once again, a lot of this stuff promotes party identity and party line politics, all of these kinds of ideas. I do like to show this one to show you what social realism usually looks like in the realm of painting. This comes from after World War II, but this is Mikhail Kamelko's The Triumph of the Victorious Motherland. So this is an actual event that took place in Red Square in Moscow after the fall of Nazi Germany, in which, these war, kind of banners and trophies were brought through, Moscow by the Red Army and thrown at the foot of Lenin's tomb. We can see Joseph Stalin standing up here, overlooking everything. We can see General Zhukov the kind of main, general of Russia in World War II, and, all of that kind of stuff. But once again, it's promoting, this kind of political ideology and all of this, and it's very staunchly realistic and, all of these kinds of things. Now, from there, we move on to Mexico and America. So we also start to see that it's during this interwar period where the New World starts to become more prominently known for its own artistic styles and everything like that. So Mexico, or in Mexico, social realism took the form of mural paintings that embodied the ideas of the revolution of 1910 to 1920. So in 1921, the new government embarked on a program to pay artists an hourly wage to decorate buildings with murals speaking to the people about their long history as well as this recent revolution and everything like that. So these were to be inspired by not only Renaissance and pre-Columbian mural work, but they also promoted traditional Mexican heritage as well as past revolutionary governments and, all kinds of things like that. But the most prominent artist in this case is Diego Rivera, who we see here. And Diego Rivera is really well known for his support of revolutionary causes, but also for his support of working class people and, their history, their plights, and all kinds of things like that. So here we can see a very early work of his. This is The Liberation of the Peon. This is specifically in reference to the Mexican Revolution, in which we see a peon or an agricultural worker here, kind of the low rung of society, if you will, has been tied up and lashed at the stake because he didn't meet his agricultural quota or his picking quota for the day. And he's working for the kind of manor house, which we see burning here in the background. But we see him being, liberated by these revolutionaries who are, have burned the manor house. They've made off with the wealth, and they're coming to rescue the common people, and they're giving him charity in hopes that he's going to help their cause later on. So once again, it's really championing average everyday people in this sense, and kind of helping to shine a spotlight on their plight, their situation, and all of these kinds of things. But Diego Rivera is really well known for doing these very grandiose, elaborate murals. And this is probably one of his more famous examples. This is in the National Palace in Mexico City. So the kind of main government building there. And it's actually about 3 stories tall. It's right in the entryway, and there's this big staircase on either side and everything like this. But it deals with a variety of different aspects of Mexican, history. So for instance, at the bottom, we can perhaps, it might be a little hard to see in this image, but we can see conquistadors coming in, fighting against the Aztecs and everything like that. We can see the national emblem of Mexico, a golden eagle devouring a serpent atop a cactus. This is actually what is said to have inspired the Aztecs to choose the location of Tenochtitlan for their capital. But we can see that kind of reference. We can see over here 2 individuals in dunce caps. This is meant to reference the Spanish Inquisition, so the rooting out of heresy and things like this. We can see other major political movements and things like that. I believe General Santa Anna is depicted over here. If we look just here in the middle, we can see Emperor Maximilian I, the first and only emperor of Mexico. This is coming out of the time period in which Cinco de Mayo, is kind of, that whole thing comes from. But once again, we see other prominent, political figures from Mexican history. We also see, common people depicted all throughout, aspects of the Catholic faith, of indigenous faiths, all kinds of different stuff like this. So once again, a lot of his artwork really upplays the idea of, common people. He did a major mural in Detroit of, the automotive workers in the factory and everything like that. So he does travel around outside of Mexico quite a bit. He does quite a few of these murals within the United States as well. But once again, if you ever get the chance to go to Mexico City and actually go see this, I would recommend it. It's just really grandiose and elaborate. You can spend hours sitting there looking at everything in it. But other than Diego Rivera, probably the other most well-known Mexican artist of this time is his wife, Frida Kahlo, who we see here. And Frida Kahlo is an interesting figure. She's a very tumultuous figure. Most of her life is actually very tragic. She was hit by a bus in her youth and, spent most of the rest of her life in and out of the hospital for various medical ailments, kind of revolving around that. And so her life is really marred by pain, by sacrifice. She becomes a severe alcoholic because of a lot of these issues. Her husband, Diego Rivera, is also really well known for cheating on her a lot. And, all kinds of things like that. But a lot of Frida Kahlo's paintings take on this much more personal and very intimate kind of, symbolic meaning to them. So a lot of her works are also done out of her hospital bed and are mostly self-portraits. So most of her artwork is self-portraiture, but they represent various aspects of her life and her story, her heritage, etc., etc. And this is one of the more interesting ones in my opinion. This is called The Two Fridas, and it's meant to reference a couple major things. First and foremost, we see Frida Kahlo depicted twice here. On the left, we see her in contemporary European clothing, and on the right, we see her in indigenous Mexican clothing. And this is an homage to the fact that her father was German and her mother was a native Mexican. So she's, not even, like from or her mother wasn't from colonial descendants. Her mother was purely indigenous and everything like that, but she has this kind of dual heritage, and as such she feels like she doesn't really fit in anywhere, or at least not wholeheartedly. So that's an interesting aspect in a lot of her work. We can also see that idea of reference in the fact that she has two hearts and they're tied together by this single blood vein. So it's the kind of, two bloodlines coming together, if you will. But we can also see that one bloodline is meant to, well, it's coming down and it's trickling onto her white dress. And this is meant to be symbolic of two major things. First and foremost, it's meant to be symbolically linked to this idea of Aztec blood sacrifice or indigenous Mexican blood sacrifice from the, kind of Aztec Mayan religions and things like that. But this is also meant to reference one of the many miscarriages that she suffers throughout her life. In fact, she was never able to have children because of injuries that she sustained in her youth. And as such, this causes her a lot of grief throughout her life. She does a lot of artwork that deals with this kind of, idea that she couldn't become a mother, which at this time in this place, this is kind of like core to being a woman and everything like that. So there's a lot of very hard feelings about it for her. So it's referenced quite a bit in a number of her works. But it's something that I find interesting about her, and even though it's a very tragic kind of element of her work, it really speaks to her own personal character and how she's trying to deal with these kinds of tragedies within her own life and everything like that. But once again, it's meant to echo this idea of not only her pain, her suffering, but her heritage, her kind of links to various cultures and things like that. But a lot of her work also begins to embrace this kind of surrealistic aspect as well. Here we can see an interesting one. This is self-portrait along the border of Mexico and the United States. And so we can see this kind of tie between this like industrialization of America and this kind of more traditional ancient realm of Mexico here. So we see symbolic motifs referencing like Aztec culture and whatnot, as well as, like industrial, kind of stuff coming out of, Detroit. She traveled with Diego Rivera to Detroit to do some of his mural work there and would have been witness to a lot of this. I like the fact that she's wearing this really pretty dress, but she's also smoking a cigarette in her hand there. And so this would be something that would be considered very unladylike at that time. But once again, it's an interesting aspect, and it's showing once again she has dual, kind of multiple cultural ties and everything like that. So I've always found her work to be very interesting on a much more personal and symbolic kind of level. Now, if we move on to the United States, during this period, during the Depression in the 1930s, the U.S. government maintained an active program of subsidy for the arts. So very much like in Mexico, the United States government is actually hiring artists to go out and do public works and things like that. So it's helping people along. But The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, commissioned painters to paint murals in public buildings. And then we also have the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, which hired photographers and filmmakers to document the Dust Bowl, which is happening at the same time as well. So this also helps the burgeoning field of documentary filmmaking and all kinds of things like that as well. So we see that photographers like Dorothea Lange begin to document the helplessness and hopelessness of the kind of unemployed during the Depression, but she's also dealing with the Dust Bowl quite a bit. So she's looking at migrant workers who are trying to flee, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, going to, like California to find agricultural work. This is where a lot of the John Steinbeck novels like Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, things like that are also dealing with the same kind of ideas. But she does a lot of this kind of documentation of the plight of average American citizens at this time. So here we can see the White Angel bread line in San Francisco. And what I love about this painting or this photograph is that we see the prominent individual here in the foreground has basically almost given up hope. And, this is, he's probably been waiting there for a long time for a free cup of soup and a piece of bread. And he's probably realized he's not getting it that day. But once again, it highlights this idea of helplessness and hopelessness in this country. And, this is supposed to be the richest country in the world, or at least even at this time, we're ramping up to that. So it's kind of the devastating aspect of this time. But in the world of painting and sculpture and things like that, we see that American regionalism really begins to take off. And so in the 1930s, the Depression, as well as the political upheaval, around the world and whatnot, motivated artists to search for both national and personal identity. So caught between a largely indifferent public and those abroad who viewed America as a kind of provincial backwater, American artists really develop a style that's more personal to them. So they're dealing with this kind of atmosphere of relative cultural isolation, but they begin to focus their attention on specifically American subjects. So, people in America can't afford artwork, so they don't really care what people are doing. And people in Europe are still looking at America as being, kind of backwards hicks and whatnot. So artists in America really just start doing their own thing and embracing that. But one of the most prominent American regionalists is Edward Hopper, and he's most well known for this painting, and this is The Night Hawks, and this is a painting done in 1942. This is kind of just at the beginning of World War II, but it's meant to, kind of echo this idea of American isolationism at this time. So a lot of Americans are really, they're looking at what's happening in Europe on the lead up. They're looking at what's happening in Asia and China specifically. And they're really saying, well, we don't want to be involved in another world war. So we should focus on us. So in this instance, we have this kind of, isolating scene. It's a night scene, middle of the night. We got a few night owls drinking coffee at an all-night coffee bar. But once again, it echoes this kind of uniquely American idea or kind of sentiment in that regard, in that, we are kind of our own people. We go off and do our own thing, if you will. We don't adhere to the rules of, other people and all that kind of idea. But once again, it's, also hearkening this kind of, because we're isolated from the world, we might also potentially be emotionally isolated. And so we're kind of cold and removed and all of that kind of idea. But aside from Edward Hopper, we also have artists like Grant Wood. He's most famous for his painting American Gothic here. So we've seen this painting before. I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, often parodied. But once again, it's meant to echo that idea of the uniquely American subject of, farmers in the Midwest and, average common people that everyone tends to overlook and everything like that. And what I find interesting is that this is actually meant to be a father and a daughter, not a husband and wife. And in fact, this is modeled after the artist's sister and the artist's dentist. There's actually a really nice photograph of the two of them standing next to the painting once it was originally displayed. But once again, it's referencing this idea of common everyday American people, their plight, their what they're all about, all of these kinds of things. But aside from Grant Wood, probably the most well-known of the American regionalists is this individual, Thomas Hart Benton. And he develops a very kind of charismatic style. He goes on to influence many abstractionist artists later on. In particular, his probably most famous student was Jackson Pollock, who we'll see next time. But he really develops this very interesting kind of take on aesthetics. So it's this very kind of undulating, curvilinear representational form. Most of his subjects deal with American history, or once again, this kind of middle America aspect of, people who are, otherwise might be forgotten within the confines of high art, if you will, and everything like that. But here we see one of several murals that are meant to represent the kind of mythology of the American Foundation story. So this is what's known as Palisade, but it's meant to be referencing the Pilgrims at Jamestown in Virginia in the early 1600s. So we see, they're building their stockade fortification. We see Squanto here, who's coming and helping them, and all of this kind of stuff. So a lot of his work really deals with these kind of American legends, if you will, or, once again, these uniquely American subjects. But that ends us off for today. So next time we'll start to look at the post-war period, so post-World War II, and getting into the contemporary world. And we'll really see how artwork begins to devolve the furthest away from its most traditional roots and becomes even more extreme in its kind of abstraction and other things like that. So until next time, we'll see you later.